My name is Evelyn Moore. I was 23 the afternoon my stepfather Richard celebrated his birthday in our backyard in Ashford. Long tables ran the length of the lawn, paper plates stacked too high, lemonade sweating through clear plastic cups. Neighbors stood in small circles talking about weather and work the way people do when nothing important is supposed to happen. I was carrying a tray of drinks when my right hand stopped obeying me. It wasn't pain, it wasn't panic, it was absence. The glass slid out of my fingers and shattered at my feet. I tried to say something simple, sorry, excuse me, but my mouth pulled to one side and no sound came out. My right leg folded clean and sudden, and I went down on the grass between two chairs. From the ground, the sky looked very calm, a clean blue. I remember thinking it was a good day for a party. I could smell charcoal. I could hear forks touching plates. I could hear the music still playing low and polite. What I couldn't do was move. My mother Margaret stood over me with her arms folded tight across her chest. She didn't kneel. She didn't ask me anything, she said flatly. She's just being dramatic again. Richard looked at the tables, then back at me like he was deciding whether this was worth interrupting. Let her lie down for a bit, he said. Don't call an ambulance. Someone laughed, quick and nervous. A chair scraped. A cooler lid snapped shut. The party adjusted and continued. I tried to lift my hand to show them something was wrong. It stayed where it was. I tried again. Nothing. The grass was cool against my cheek. A fly landed on my wrist and walked slowly toward my palm. No one brushed it away. There are moments when your body is calling for help, and the people around you decide it's inconvenient. I didn't understand that yet. I was still waiting for someone to notice without being told. If you're listening right now and something about this feels familiar, stay with me. Before this day was over, I would learn exactly how far silence can go and what it costs when no one speaks up. And if stories about family illness and the quiet moments that change everything matter to you, I hope you'll subscribe and stay. This is only the beginning. Time moved in small, ordinary details. Ice melted in a cup. A child asked for ketchup. Someone nudged the broken glass aside with the toe of a shoe. My mother told an aunt I'd been stressed lately. Richard asked if anyone was ready for cake. I focused on what stayed still. The folded napkins, the shadow of the oak shifting a few inches, the sound of a phone unlocking somewhere behind me, then locking again. No one dialed. I don't remember asking for help. I remember watching, listening, taking note. When there are no choices left, observation becomes preparation. And I was already learning what I would need to remember. I stayed where I was because there was nowhere else to go. The grass pressed into my cheek. The music kept its rhythm. Plates moved from hand to hand. From the ground, ankles and chair legs passed through my field of view like traffic. No one looked down for long. Then Lena Brooks appeared in that narrow strip of vision. She didn't hover. She didn't shout. She set her bag on the grass and knelt, so her face was level with mine. The shade from the oak fell across her shoulder. I noticed a smear of barbecue sauce on her thumb. Small things stayed sharp. Evelyn, she said once. Not louder the second time. She didn't ask how I felt. She asked me to smile. I tried. The request landed somewhere, but the response didn't follow. The left side of my mouth moved. The right didn't. Lena nodded as if confirming a measurement. She took my right hand and lifted it a few inches. When she let go, it fell back to the grass without resistance. She watched it land. She checked the time on her phone. I heard the tap. I saw her screen light up and go dark again. These are signs of a stroke, she said clearly to the space around us. I'm calling 911. My mother's voice came from above, tight with irritation. Don't make a scene. Someone echoed her softer. Someone else said it was probably dehydration. Richard asked if Lena was a doctor. Lena didn't answer. She stood, stepped forward, and put herself between me and the circle that had formed. Her back blocked my view of my mother's shoes. She dialed. She spoke in short sentences. Address, age, symptoms, onset. She used the word acute. She gave the time. I recognized the cadence from forms I'd filled out before clean factual complete. When the operator asked if I was conscious, Lena said yes. When they asked if I could speak, she said no. She didn't soften anything. The party didn't stop so much as it shifted. Someone turned the music down a notch. A cooler scraped across the concrete. A child asked if the ambulance would have lights. My mother told Lena she was overreacting. Richard said it would be expensive. Lena kept the phone at her ear and nodded once, as if acknowledging instructions. She asked me to squeeze her fingers. I couldn't. She asked me to blink twice if I could hear her. I did. She told the operator that too. I noticed the sun had moved far enough that the shade no longer covered my eyes. I closed them. When I opened them again, Lena was still there. The siren arrived before the argument finished forming. It cut through the backyard with a precision I appreciated. The paramedics moved with practiced economy. Names, vitals. A blood pressure cuff tightened and released. Someone asked when the symptoms started. Lena answered without looking at my mother. She gave the same time she'd checked earlier. A clipboard appeared. A pen scratched. I heard the word timeline. I heard window. I heard transport. No one asked my mother to decide anything. That detail registered. As they lifted me, Lena gathered my phone from the grass and placed it in my bag. She zipped it closed. She told the paramedic she would follow in her car. She didn't ask permission. When the stretcher rolled, she walked alongside until the gate narrowed the path. I didn't thank her. I didn't need to. The facts were already lining up, orderly and undeniable. When choice disappears, responsibility becomes visible. That afternoon, the record began to write itself. The stretcher locked into place with a sound that felt final. Metal meeting metal. The doors closed and the noise from the backyard dropped away, replaced by the steady hum of the engine and the thin electronic beeping above my head. The ceiling of the ambulance was low and clean, white panels, a fluorescent strip that flickered once before settling. A paramedic introduced himself, then repeated my name to confirm it. I heard it clearly. I couldn't answer. He placed 2 fingers against my neck, then my wrist, counting without looking at a clock. Another cuff tightened around my arm and released. Numbers were spoken aloud and repeated back. The ritual mattered more than reassurance. Acute stroke, one of them said, not to me, but into the space where notes are taken. The word acute landed and stayed. They asked when the symptoms started. It wasn't a question meant for guessing. It was a request for a timestamp. Lena answered from the bench along the wall. 30 to 40 minutes ago, she said. Her voice didn't waver. She gave the address again. She gave my age. She said the words sudden onset and right side weakness. I watched her thumb rest on the edge of her phone, ready as if the record might need correcting. One of the paramedics nodded and adjusted the IV line. The other looked at the clock mounted above the rear doors. He said plainly, if she'd arrived within the first 15 minutes, the damage could have been far less. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't apologize for the sentence. He said it the way you say a measurement that can't be changed. I noted the phrasing. Could have been, conditional, past tense. The window he was referring to had a name. I knew that. I'd read enough pamphlets in waiting rooms to recognize the language. Golden window, time-sensitive intervention, outcomes correlated with delay. This was not a moral assessment. It was math. The siren rose and fell. Red light passed through the rear windows in intervals, painting the ceiling and then removing itself. The paramedic asked me to squeeze his hand. I watched my fingers remain open. He marked something on the chart. He asked me to follow his finger with my eyes. I did. That went down as a success. They placed an oxygen mask over my mouth and nose. The elastic pulled slightly at my hair. The air smelled clean, faintly plastic. I focused on breathing because it was one of the few instructions I could still execute without translation. Lena told them I had collapsed during a family gathering. She did not add commentary. When asked if anyone had delayed calling for help, she paused for a beat and said yes. The pause was important. It separated observation from accusation. The ambulance took a turn. My body shifted against the straps. The beeping quickened, then steadied. Someone asked if I was on any medications. Lena listed them from memory. She spelled my last name when requested. The form filled itself through her voice. As the hospital came into view, the paramedic pressed a button and spoke ahead. Stroke team. ETA 3 minutes. Age 23. Symptom onset 30 to 40 minutes prior. The words traveled faster than I could. My awareness narrowed not dramatically, but methodically. sounds flattened, the ceiling lights blurred at the edges. I held on to what remained concrete the time given the sentence spoke in the order of events. Cause precedes effect. Delay precedes damage. That sequence did not require belief. It required acknowledgement. By the time the doors opened again, the window they had named was already closed. By the time the ambulance doors opened, the language had already shifted. Hallways replaced yards, badges replaced faces. The floor changed from grass to tile polished enough to reflect the lights overhead. My name appeared on a wristband in black ink. Date of birth, time of arrival. Everything needed a place. While they moved me from stretcher to bed, I noticed how quickly the present fills with forms. Clipboards, consent screens, a pen tethered by a string. The nurse asked questions in a steady sequence. Allergies, medications, next of kin. Lena answered when I couldn't. The answers stayed factual. No one asked how this felt. That question doesn't help the chart. As they worked, my mind moved backward, not out of sentiment, but because the pattern was already familiar. The stroke didn't introduce anything new. It confirmed a process. My biological father died years earlier suddenly and without witnesses. A phone call in the middle of a weekday, a funeral conducted efficiently. After that, my mother reorganized her life with the same efficiency. She married Richard within the year. The house changed, furniture replaced, walls repainted in neutral tones. The goal was coherence, nothing out of place, nothing that suggested interruption. Richard believed in schedules. Dinner at 6, shoes by the door, conversations that resolved quickly. He said order made things easier for everyone. My mother agreed. They shared a preference for smooth surfaces, no raised voices, no pauses that lingered. Problems were handled by minimizing them until they stopped being visible. I learned early what qualified as a problem. If I asked too many questions, I was overly sensitive. If I objected, I was dramatic. If I didn't adapt quickly enough, I was not fitting in. These weren't insults so much as classifications, labels that explained why attention should move elsewhere. At family gatherings, I was described as independent. The word carried approval. It meant I didn't require checking on. If I was quiet, that was maturity. If I was absent, that was self-sufficiency. My mother repeated the word often, especially when someone asked where I was. When I got sick, the response followed protocol. Wait and see. Don't rush. Don't assume the worst. I was advised to drink water, to rest, to stop reading into things. The instruction was always to scale my concern down to match the room. I complied because it kept the peace, and peace was treated as an outcome. In the hospital bed with the monitor ticking steadily beside me, I watched a nurse adjust the IV and tape it in place. She smoothed the edge of the tape with her thumb once, twice. Precision without commentary. It occurred to me that this was the first environment where my condition was not being negotiated. A social worker appeared briefly at the foot of the bed, introduced herself, and made a note to return. Her badge caught the light. She asked who had brought me in. Lena answered. The question was logged. Later, when my mother arrived, she stood at the doorway rather than the bedside. She asked what the doctors had said, then asked how long this would take. She said she had work in the morning. The phrasing mattered. Duration, impact, scheduling. No one told her to sit. The stroke did not create distance. It clarified it. What I had experienced as personal was procedural. When a system prizes order above all else, anything that disrupts it is reframed as excess, noise, drama, a scene. As the room settled into its night rhythm, the dimmed lights, the low voices, the cart rolling past at regular intervals, I began to understand the advantage of records. They do not adjust themselves to keep things comfortable. They hold. Dates, times, statements made, statements avoided. This was not a reckoning. It was documentation. Morning arrived without ceremony. The room brightened in increments, not all at once. A line of light slipped under the curtain, then climbed the wall until it reached the whiteboard. My name was written there in block letters. Date, room number, a list of medications abbreviated into codes. Someone had circled the time of my last assessment. I woke because the monitor changed its tone. Not an alarm, a reminder. I tried to shift my weight and found that half of it did not respond. The left side of my body lay where it had been placed, arranged and unclaimed. I waited for sensation to catch up. It didn't. I tried to sit. My torso tilted and stopped. The bed rail pressed into my forearm. I stayed there angled until a nurse noticed and adjusted the pillows. She asked me to lift my left arm. I watched my right do the work of looking. The left remained still. She nodded once and documented it. Strength 0 out of 5. Sensation diminished. She said the words as if placing items into labeled drawers. Later, the doctor came in with a tablet held against his chest. He introduced himself again, although we had met the night before. He stood where he could see the monitor and the doorway at the same time. My mother and stepfather stood near the window just inside the room, coats still on. Lena took the chair by the bed and moved it closer without asking. The doctor spoke to the room, not to any one person. He explained the imaging, he explained the areas affected, he explained what could be expected in the near term and what would require reassessment. When he reached the point that mattered, he did not soften it. This level of damage, he said, is directly linked to delayed intervention. He paused long enough for the sentence to be recorded. Not by a machine, by the people present. My mother looked at the floor. The pattern in the linoleum held her attention. Richard checked his watch, pressed the button to wake the screen, then let it go dark again. The doctor continued outlining rehabilitation options, timelines, and contingencies. He used ranges instead of promises. He asked when the symptoms were first observed. Lena answered. She gave the same time she had given in the ambulance. She referenced the call log on her phone when asked. She did not look at my mother. The doctor acknowledged the timeline and noted it on the tablet. A line item appeared and was closed. The nurse returned with a tray, coffee in a paper cup untouched and already cooling. A plastic lid clicked into place. I watched the steam thin and disappear. She adjusted the bed so I could see the clock. Time is easier to manage when it's visible. My mother asked how long I would need to stay. The doctor said it depended on response to therapy and stability. She asked if I would be able to work. He said that determination would come later. She asked if insurance covered rehabilitation. He said a coordinator would follow up. Each question narrowed the frame. Each answer stayed within it. Lena asked about physical therapy. Frequency. Start date. Whether speech therapy was indicated. The doctor answered her directly. He mentioned consults and referrals. He said orders would be placed. He said someone would come by with paperwork. When the doctor left the room settled again, the monitor returned to its steady rhythm. My stepfather stood closer to the door than before. My mother smoothed the sleeve of her coat and said she would check on the car. She did not touch the bed. The door closed with a controlled sound. Lena stayed. She wrote down the names she had heard and the times they were mentioned. She folded the paper and placed it in her bag. The facts were aligning, not as accusations, as sequence. I lay still and let the room do what it does. In hospitals, causes are named without ceremony, effects are measured. The rest is logistics. By afternoon, the room had been rearranged for planning. A rolling table replaced the breakfast tray. A stack of folders appeared where the coffee cup had cooled and been taken away. The whiteboard was updated with a new heading, Rehab Consult. The letters were neat, written by someone who expected them to be read. The physician returned with a therapist and a case coordinator. They spoke in sequence, each waiting for the other to finish. Long-term rehabilitation. Inpatient first, then outpatient. Frequency measured in days per week, not months. Benchmarks. Reassessments. They used phrases like functional goals and anticipated duration. Nothing speculative. Nothing personal. At one point, the coordinator turned the tablet so it faced the family side of the room. She explained that for the next phase, consent was required, not consent for treatment in the abstract, consent for support, transportation, attendance, follow-through. The words were careful. The implication wasn't. I was still flagged as temporarily unable to make medical decisions. The notation was visible on the screen, highlighted in gray. It was neither an insult nor a judgment. It was a status. My mother listened without interrupting. She asked for clarification only when the coordinator mentioned schedules. She asked whether signatures could be deferred. She asked what would happen if no one signed. If we don't sign, she said, the hospital handles it anyway, right? The coordinator answered evenly. She explained the limits of what the hospital could do without family participation. She explained timelines. She explained what would trigger further review. She used the word documentation more than once. My stepfather shifted his weight. He stood closer to the door than the bed. He said nothing. He checked his watch again, the gesture now habitual. Then my mother said the second sentence as if closing a file. She's 23, she said. We can't take on this responsibility. No one raised their voice. No one argued. The therapist glanced at the coordinator. The coordinator made a note. A small sound, the stylus tapping glass. The physician nodded once as if acknowledging a boundary that had just been defined. I watched the exchange from the bed, aware of how clean it was. No accusations, no defenses, just a refusal placed on the table and accepted as such, the kind of refusal that reads clearly when transcribed. The coordinator explained next steps, alternative pathways, external services, the involvement of another department if needed. She said it without urgency. This was not an emergency. This was process. My mother asked whether insurance would be affected. The coordinator said coverage would be assessed independently. My mother nodded. She asked if she needed to sign anything to decline. The coordinator said no. Declining required no paperwork. That detail stayed with me. When the meeting ended, the therapist left first. The physician followed, pausing to say he would place the orders discussed. The coordinator remained long enough to hand Lena a card and circle a number. She said to call if there were questions. She said someone would return later with forms. My mother stepped to the bedside at last, close enough that I could see the texture of her coat sleeve. She asked if I needed anything before she went. The question was open-ended and therefore safe. I didn't answer. She waited a moment, then nodded to herself and turned away. The door closed. The sound was controlled, not a slam, not a hesitation, a closure. Lena moved the rolling table back toward the wall and sat. She didn't comment on what had been said. She wrote down the phrases she'd heard and the times they were spoken. She underlined one sentence. She folded the paper. What had just occurred did not feel dramatic. It felt final in a way that doesn't announce itself. A decision recorded without resistance, a responsibility declined without ceremony. In the quiet that followed, I understood the shape of it. Not abandonment as an emotion, but refusal as a fact. And facts once entered don't need persuasion to hold. The next morning, the room changed again, not in layout, but in purpose. The light was sharper, angled through the blinds instead of filtered by them. The coffee on the tray cooled untouched. A clipboard appeared at the foot of the bed where the rolling table had been. This one stayed. A woman introduced herself and showed her badge before she said anything else. Adult Protective Services, printed in small official type. She asked if it was a good time to talk. The question was procedural. The answer didn't matter much. She pulled a chair closer, close enough to hear the monitor without raising her voice. She explained why she was there, not with emphasis, not with sympathy. The hospital had reported 2 items requiring review, delayed emergency response, and refusal of medical support. She used those exact phrases. She said they came from documentation already entered into the record. She said her role was to verify, not to interpret. She asked me to confirm my name and date of birth. She asked whether I understood where I was. I nodded. She noted that. She asked if I could speak. I shook my head. She adjusted her approach without comment. Lena stood by the window, arms folded loosely, the way you stand when you expect to be asked something. When the APS worker asked who had been present at the time of the incident, Lena stepped forward. She gave names. She gave times. She referenced the call log again. She described the symptoms she had observed and the statements made before she called 911. She did not editorialize. She did not raise her voice. She spoke as if answering questions on a form because that is what she was doing. The APS worker listened and wrote. When she finished one page, she turned it over and continued on the next. She asked whether anyone had attempted to stop Lena from calling for help. Lena said yes. She asked who. Lena answered. The names were recorded without reaction. When it was my turn, the APS worker shifted slightly so I could see her face. She asked whether I had asked anyone to call an ambulance. I shook my head. She asked whether I had been able to ask. I shook my head again. She marked the distinction. She explained what would happen next. Her words were careful. She said this was an assessment, not an accusation. She said outcomes varied depending on findings. She said her responsibility was to ensure safety and continuity of care. She did not promise anything. She did not threaten anything. She explained thresholds. Then she asked the question she had been building toward. Is there anyone you trust to act as your medical proxy? The room was quiet enough that the monitor sounded louder than usual. The question was not emotional. It was practical. It required a name, not a story. I took a moment, not because I was conflicted, but because I wanted to be accurate. Accuracy mattered now. I thought of people who had used my condition to measure inconvenience. I thought of the one person who had stood between me and the crowd without being asked. I gave a name. She wrote it down. She asked how we were related. She asked when we last had contact. She asked if I believed he would be willing to assume that role. I nodded. She said she would verify and follow up. Before she left, she explained that APS would document what had occurred regardless of who stepped in next. She said records existed to preserve sequence, not to assign blame. She said her report would include timelines, statements, and observed capacity at the time of refusal. She said it would be added to my file. When the door closed behind her, the room returned to its low hum. A cart passed. Someone laughed down the hall. Life continued at a speed that no longer included me in the same way. Lena exhaled and leaned against the counter. She asked if I was sure about the name I'd given. I nodded. She didn't ask anything else. The system had entered the room and left again, having taken what it needed. What remained was a line drawn cleanly without noise. From that point on, decisions would be recorded differently. Authority would come from documents, not assumptions. I watched the light move across the wall and understood that something essential had shifted, not because anyone argued, but because someone neutral had written it down. After APS left, the room stayed quiet in a different way. Not empty, settled. The clipboard remained at the foot of the bed, its pages turned to a fresh section. A note had been added to the whiteboard beneath my name, pending proxy. The letters were smaller than the medication list, written in careful print. It took less time than I expected. APS located Thomas Hale through records that hadn't been updated in years. My father's older brother. A name that still existed in files even after it stopped being spoken aloud. I hadn't seen him since my father's funeral. We exchanged holiday cards for a while, then those stopped too. No conflict, just distance maintained by silence. Late afternoon brought a knock that wasn't a knock. A pause, then the door opening halfway. A man stood there, holding a folded jacket over his arm. He looked at the whiteboard first, then at me. He didn't step in until a nurse nodded. Thomas crossed the room slowly, as if not to disturb the machines. He set the jacket on the chair and remained standing. He asked how I was doing. Not how do you feel, not what happened. Just how are you doing? I nodded once. He accepted that as sufficient. The coordinator returned with a folder. She explained the document in neutral terms. Emergency medical proxy authorization. Scope, duration, revocation terms. Thomas listened without interrupting. He asked one question: where to sign. The coordinator pointed. He signed in a single line, no hesitation. The pen made a brief final sound against the paper. No one raised their voice. No one looked relieved. The moment didn't ask for reaction. A nurse updated the board while we watched. She erased the previous line and wrote a new one. Emergency care contact Thomas Hale. Black marker, straight letters. She stepped back to check spacing, then capped the marker and placed it in her pocket. That was it. No announcement. No ceremony. The change existed because it had been recorded. Thomas sat down after that. He pulled the chair closer but didn't touch the bed. He asked whether Lena had been here. I nodded. He said he was glad. He asked whether I needed anything right then. I shook my head. He waited a moment longer, then nodded once and settled into stillness. My mother did not return that evening. Richard did not call. No one asked who had signed. The system had already moved on. A physical therapist came in later and confirmed the next day's schedule. She addressed Thomas when she explained transportation. He said he would handle it. She made a note. The note closed another loop. When visiting hours ended, Thomas stood and picked up his jacket. He said he would be back in the morning. He said it the way you state a plan, not a promise. He left the room quietly. The door closed behind him without catching. I lay there and watched the lights dim in sequence. The monitor continued its steady pattern. The whiteboard remained unchanged. He was not my guardian. No one had used that word. He was simply the person who had signed so treatment could continue. The distinction mattered. Authority came from the document, not the relationship. For the first time since the ambulance ride, there was no pending decision above my head. No question waiting to be answered. A line had been drawn and it held. Outside the window, the sky darkened evenly. Inside, everything stayed where it had been placed. That was enough. Discharge came without celebration. A nurse read the instructions aloud while Thomas stood at the foot of the bed and listened. Dates, dosages, appointment times written in ink that would fade if left in the sun. The final signature was placed where the line told it to be placed. The bed rails lowered, the wheelchair appeared. The room returned to neutral, ready for the next name. Thomas drove me to his house just after noon. The ride was quiet. He adjusted the seatbelt once, making sure it wasn't pressing where it shouldn't. The radio stayed off. Outside the window, fields passed in steady segments divided by fence posts and time. He took the long way, the one without traffic lights. It made the motion easier to track. His house was small and orderly, shoes by the door, a clock on the wall that ticked loud enough to hear. He showed me the room I would use and placed my bag on the chair rather than the floor. He asked if the light was too bright. I shook my head. He nodded and left the door open a few inches. Physical therapy began the next morning. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and coffee that had been sitting too long. My name was printed on a schedule taped to the wall. The therapist explained the plan in plain terms: range of motion, strength, repetition, progress measured weekly. She asked if I was ready. The question had a practical meaning. I nodded. The work was simple and not easy. Stand, shift weight. Sit. Rest. Repeat. When I fell, the therapist marked it down without comment and adjusted the mat. Thomas watched from the chair by the window. He did not reach for me. He did not flinch. He waited until I stood again on my own. At home, he set up a space in the garage with a chair, a rail, and a strip of tape on the floor to mark distance. Every morning, he moved his truck out first, so there was room. He swept the concrete before I started. The radio played low, old stations, no surprises. There were days when my left side refused to cooperate. On those days, we did fewer repetitions. Thomas did not fill the time with encouragement. He reset the timer and said we would try again tomorrow. He kept track of appointments on a calendar by the phone. Blue ink for therapy, black ink for follow-ups. Nothing was circled. He never asked when I would be normal again. He never used the word recovery as a destination. Once after a long session, I sat on the step outside the garage and focused on breathing until the shaking stopped. Thomas handed me a bottle of water and said, "If you're breathing today, that's enough." He said it once. He did not repeat it. Mail arrived in small stacks. Bills, notices, insurance explanations that required reading twice. Thomas placed them in order and brought them to the table after dinner. We reviewed them line by line. He pointed to the parts that mattered. He made the calls when authorization was needed. When a form required my signature, he waited until my hand steadied and then slid the paper closer. Weeks passed in measured increments. I walked farther. I fell less. The tape on the floor moved an inch at a time. The clock on the wall kept its pace. No one from my old house came by. No one asked for updates. The absence did not announce itself. It simply stayed absent. In the evenings, I stood in the doorway of the room Thomas had given me and looked out at the quiet street. Lights went on and off in other houses, doors closed. Somewhere a lawn sprinkler clicked to life and stopped. Nothing demanded my attention. That was new. Recovery did not arrive as a turning point. It accumulated. Presents instead of promises. A day completed. Another added to it. In that sequence, something settled. Not triumph, not forgiveness, just the space to keep going. By the time the report arrived, my routine was already set. Therapy in the morning, rest in the afternoon, paperwork at the table in the evening. The mail came just after 4. Thomas brought it in and placed it in a neat stack separating envelopes that required attention from those that didn't. The envelope from Adult Protective Services was thin. No urgency markings. Just a return address and my name spelled correctly. I opened it at the table where we reviewed bills. The light was even. The coffee beside me had gone cold without being noticed. The report was written in plain language, arranged by headings and dates. Incident summary, timeline, statements, findings, no adjectives, no speculation. On the second page, under conclusion, a single sentence was centered and underlined. Failure to seek timely medical care. It stood alone, unembellished. Not an accusation, a determination. I read the rest to confirm there were no conditions attached. There weren't. The report noted delayed emergency response. It noted refusal of medical support. It listed witnesses. It listed documents reviewed. It closed with a statement about record retention and future reference. The tone never changed. I folded the report along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope. The paper made a clean sound when it settled. I did not feel the need to show it to anyone. Thomas asked if I needed him to file it. I said yes. He placed it in a folder labeled with the month and year. He slid the folder into a drawer and closed it. That evening, my phone vibrated once on the counter. A missed call from my mother. No message, no follow-up. I noted the time. I did not return it. The decision did not require rehearsal. It followed the same rule the report did. Once documented, it stands. There were no confrontations to resolve, no statements to deliver. The record already contained what mattered. Anything said afterward would only introduce noise. The next morning, I stood at the window while Thomas made coffee. The street was quiet. A delivery truck stopped, then moved on. A neighbor's door closed. The day arranged itself without instruction. I noticed that I was standing without holding onto the frame. The fact registered, then passed. Later, I updated my address with the clinic and the insurance provider. I signed where indicated. I mailed the forms. When asked for an emergency contact, I wrote Thomas's name. The pen paused briefly, then continued. Accuracy mattered more than speed. Weeks later, the old house remained absent from my days. No visits, no inquiries. The silence held. I did not interpret it. I accepted it as confirmation. In the evenings, I stood in the small space that had become mine, the doorway, the step outside the stretch of sidewalk where I practiced walking without thinking about it. The air cooled. Lights came on in sequence. Somewhere nearby, a door closed. Somewhere else, one opened. None of it required my participation. Justice did not arrive as vindication. It arrived as clarity, a line drawn and respected, a boundary that did not need defending because it was already in place. I did not call my old home again. Not everyone who gives birth to you stays, but the ones who stay usually arrive quietly.